If you don't yet have a high-quality board, but you do have the ambition to build a startup with revenues of 100 million, then you definitely need to convene a board quickly.
At the same time, serving on a startup board can be attractive to board members.
Startups are always lacking something. They lack expertise, they lack people, they lack specialists, and they lack capital.
Is there a truly best practice for implementing a board in a startup?
Bringing in relatives, appointing people who don't care, giving them board seats and waiting for results, that is mistake number one. We want to see many strong world-class Ukrainian startups and businesses on the global stage.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Board of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel. Today our guest is Taras Kyrychenko. Welcome, Taras.
Hello, everyone.
Taras is a chair and member of supervisory and advisory boards. He is also a co-founder of the Toloka Investment Syndicate. The Toloka Investment Syndicate invests, among other things, in startups. Today, Taras and I will be discussing the topic of boards of directors in startups. Taras, boards of directors, supervisory boards, and advisory boards in startups differ significantly from boards in traditional businesses. Some even say this is a separate type of board, with its own specifics, information, purpose, role, and overall function. What do you think are the key characteristics of boards specifically in startups?
First of all, Sergey, thank you for what you're doing to promote board culture. You know my view, sometimes boards are useful and quite often they can be harmful. But in order to truly understand both the value and the risks of boards, you need to listen to Sergiy Bulavin's channel and to listen carefully to the wise advice of both him and his guests. So thank you for the invitation. Today's topic is not as straightforward or as obviously lucrative as it may seem at first glance, but in reality, it is even more complex and even more financially impactful than boards in traditional companies. You asked how startup boards differ from boards of large, mature, or mid-sized companies. I have experience in all of these contexts. At one point, I was a member of the supervisory board of a large state-owned corporation, Bank. Currently, I serve as the chair of the supervisory board of Nova Poshta. It is a private company, but by no means a small organization. I am also deeply involved in the boards of mid-sized companies and startup boards, so I can genuinely share some insights into how these differ. First of all, it's about scale. A startup board usually consists of 3 or 4 people, and rarely more than 5. In large organizations, a board may include 7, 8, 10, or even 15 members. That fundamentally changes the dynamics. The second factor is focus. What is the purpose of a board? In a traditional corporation or a large mature organization, the board's role is largely about oversight. In a startup, the primary focus is growth, the development of the business and the startup itself. Furthermore, while classical corporate governance is highly procedural, where every word is carefully weighed and every document formally recorded, startup boards tend to be less formal, more dynamic, and designed to deliver value to the organization much faster. Another difference is that in large organizations, board members are often not the actual shareholders but their representatives. In startups, however, you will frequently see the owner, the founder, who may also be acting as the CEO, sitting on the board. You will also see investor representatives, such as angel investors or representatives of venture capital firms investing their own capital and that of their partners. So this board is significantly closer to the owners and to those who invest capital, compensation and incentives. In startups, compensation is usually structured around equity and less often around a small cash payment. So, dear viewers of Sergiy Bulavin's channel and his board-related content, if you are trying to earn retainers or generate stable cash income from startup boards, I have to disappoint you. Most likely it will not work because startups often do not even have enough money to pay founders' salaries, let alone compensate board members. On the other hand, boards can make you successful and wealthy because they can offer you a solid or even very strong equity stake in the company. In contrast, more established corporations usually offer a stable, market-average level of compensation and remuneration for board members. By serving on several boards, a qualified professional can, in principle, earn a decent living. Dynamics and control. In large corporations, the CEO is a hired executive, while in startup boards, the CEO is very often also an owner. Slightly different dynamics, a different balance of power within the board. These are the key differences between traditional boards in large organizations and startup boards. In other words, as the English would say, this is a complete black sheep. It is fundamentally different from the traditional boards you may already be familiar with if you regularly watch Sergiy Bulavin's channel.
Taras, so what are they actually closer to? If not supervision or control, then the main focus of such boards is probably growth and development. In that sense, they are closer to advisory boards than to supervisory boards.
I do not draw a strict distinction between advisory boards and supervisory boards, because if you create an advisory board that gives you advice but you ignore it, then what is the point of creating it? And if you listen to it and retain veto rights over certain decisions, then in practice it becomes a board with your veto power as the owner. This is absolutely normal, but it is still important not to deceive yourself. Such boards can have a very strong influence on decision-making to the point where the owner will use veto power only in cases where something is clearly unacceptable to them. When we talk about a supervisory board, we usually mean a combined board structure, where 2 to 3 representatives of different investors may sit at the same table, along with 1 and less often 2 independent directors. In addition, there may be 1, 2, or 3 founders or senior executives of the company. Together, they essentially shape the future of the company and demonstrate what they can contribute to its development. This is why it is a more action-oriented body that actively supports business growth. In this sense, by the way, they are quite similar to the boards of mid-sized Ukrainian companies, where boards are not primarily focused on control but rather on business development. So there are many similarities with boards of mid-sized companies. Thankfully, I have experience both in startups and in mid-sized companies, so I can speak about this professionally.
Taras, I often come across the title non-executive director of a startup. That is, not a board member as such, but a non-executive director working with a startup. Does this mean that there can be independent directors working with a startup without formally establishing a board?
From my point of view, anything is possible in life, and there is no need to limit reality with artificial constraints, but it would be unusual. Typically, in startups and in the Anglo-Saxon corporate governance model, boards are composed of both executive and non-executive directors. At the same table, as I mentioned earlier, you will find top managers and founders, investor representatives who usually serve as non-executive directors, and independent directors who are also non-executive. So it is perfectly normal for someone to hand you a business card with the title NED, but most likely, there is an actual board in place within that company.
Startups usually have significant specific characteristics when it comes to forming a board and defining its composition, including the required areas of expertise for board members. How does this work in practice? In large companies, this is quite straightforward. There is a current situation, there is a high-level strategic vision, and based on that, the board composition is designed. But how does this work in startups?
Well, look, in practice, it works in a very similar way. What distinguishes a startup from a traditional corporation? First of all, it is the speed of growth and the pace of business development, and accordingly, the required speed of managerial decision-making and response. So when we talk about startup boards, they can evolve depending on the stage or funding round the startup is in. At the pre-seed stage, most likely you will have a board that is highly informal because the company may not even be incorporated yet. You may only have the founder, or 1, 2, or 3, perhaps 1 early investor who may also act as an advisor or someone else serving in an advisory role. At this stage, the board's core role is to help determine whether the product is actually needed by the market and to guide the startup through the product market fit phase. Very often, this takes the form of informal support and mentoring for the CEO. By sharing their experience, board members help ensure that the founder does not waste time on things that distract from the core task, building the business. When we move to Series A, although the boundaries between rounds are becoming more blurred, you will most likely have 1 or 2 founders, 1 or 2 investors, and representatives of a venture capital fund. At this point, a control function starts to emerge. For example, oversight of capital deployment, the introduction of financial reporting and discipline, the formalization of strategy, and a more structured approach to testing business hypotheses. If we talk about Series B, this typically means 2 or 3 VCs from different investment rounds. There is almost always at least 1 independent director by this stage, and sometimes 2. The work becomes more formalized and board committees begin to appear. At the growth stage, Series C and beyond, there will already be representatives of different classes of investors. This includes both the early backers who supported the founder at the very beginning and several representatives of different venture capital investors and funds that have invested in the company. And at that stage, the primary objective becomes even faster: scaling, business expansion, potential M&A activity, and preparation of the company for a sale or an IPO. In other words, these are already different set of priorities. At later stages, especially at the pre-IPO stage, board members with experience in public companies begin to join. People with hands-on IPO experience, because this expertise becomes critical for the company's future. So, of course, mentoring exists at every stage, and including on supervisory boards, but here it tends to be even more informal in nature. This applies both at mid-stage and late-stage phases. The roles of board members evolve depending on what the company needs at a given moment.
How quickly do companies move through these stages?
That depends on how aggressively the company wants to grow. Investors typically want very rapid growth. But what holds a company back? Competition, limited capital, and the ability to quickly test hypotheses or build new functionality. For example, according to recent research and estimates, AI-native startups reach $1 million in revenue in an average of 11 months. By comparison, SaaS startups typically take almost twice as long. Traditional businesses, on the other hand, often take up to 5 years to reach $1 million in revenue. So it depends on the business model, the industry, the founder's capabilities, and of course the ambition to grow.
And this clearly indicates that the current board composition is highly likely to change in the near future at the next stage of the company's development.
Everything changes, as King Solomon famously said. In traditional companies, boards typically change every 5 to 7 years. Not entirely, there is usually partial rotation. But on the other hand, imagine that you are an early-stage investor representative. At later stages, this investor may be bought out by larger later-stage investors, and in that case, they will of course be asked to step down from the board. Or there may be a situation where it becomes clear that a particular founder, for example, someone holding a 20-30% stake, is no longer adding value to the company, neither as a senior executive, nor as a business developer, nor as a board member, and in that case, they may be asked to step aside. In addition, startups continuously issue different classes of shares. These different classes come with different investor requirements and expectations tied to their investment. All of this, layer by layer, affects the structure and composition of the startup's board. So naturally, everything is constantly evolving.
We have already discussed the compensation for board members in startups, but what about time commitment?
Well, it depends on what you agree on, but typically, let's be realistic. People who are truly capable of providing high-quality support to a startup or any business usually have very limited time. Experienced CEOs understand how valuable board members' time is, and they do not waste it on trivial matters. In my view, having board meetings once a month, once every 2 months, or once per quarter, depending on the company's practices, is reasonable. However, there are often interim calls, ad hoc requests, and ongoing email communication. All of this also requires time.
Taras, is a board useful for every startup, or are there cases where a board can actually be harmful?
Of course, a board can be harmful. It's just like a knife can be harmful. You can cut yourself, injure someone else, or misuse it. Can we say that a board can also cause serious damage if misused? Absolutely. That is why I always say you can't appreciate the value of a board without understanding the harm it can cause. Most often it can turn into empty talk where decisions and discussions never translate into action or results. And this is the biggest waste, because you will have a board, you will spend your own time and the time of others, yet it will deliver no real value to your business. Still, just like a kitchen needs a knife, a company needs a board. If you believe that smart people on a board will interfere with your ability to run the business, fine, do not invite them. But why would intelligent people get in your way? If you truly believe you have all the answers to every question, then perhaps you are a genius the world has never seen. But most likely it is simply overconfidence.
And there are probably other challenges for board members as well. For example, startups usually do not have large teams. Much of the work is done by the founders and the small core team, and they typically work far more than a standard employee would. 8 hours a day, and that's it, right? In reality, they work significantly more. As a result, there is often a shortage of staff and specialized expertise in startups. Naturally, this creates a temptation for board members to step into operational management.
Of course, that temptation exists. But the question is why? Why would you spend your life and time on operational management in a company that you do not own? If you simply have nothing else to do, fine. If you feel a personal calling, great. If you want to eventually join the company as an employee, that might also make sense.
This is a real challenge for people who transition from executive careers into non-executive roles. Because they may still remain mentally in an executive mode, they can be pulled back into operational thinking and behavior.
Well, listen, the right to work exists. It is guaranteed by the Constitution. So if someone wants to work with my startup, Sergiy, imagine that you and I are co-founders of a startup recording lectures about boards, and imagine that someone like Ludo, who teaches at UCGA, or Okunev, who teaches at CGPA, says, "Can I help you produce these episodes?" Well, of course. Thank you very much. And if it is for free, that is even better. So, of course, this should be welcomed. And as owners, we would say, great, instead of just the two of us talking, we now also have these strong experienced people involved. So this is something to encourage. But the real question is whether this person will act as a true executive, meaning taking responsibility for their decisions and actions. That is a different issue.
What other challenges or traps exist in startup boards?
There are two major pitfalls that are often briefly mentioned even in large mature boards: duty of care and duty of loyalty. These are of course extremely important, and there is a lot of theory around them, but in startups they can become especially visible. For example, duty of loyalty means that if I am representing an investor, the investor's interests may diverge from the interests of the company. If I sit on the board, I am expected to act in the best interests of the company, even if that sometimes means acting against my own interests. Another situation, I obtained a board seat as an investor and I am supposed to prepare for board meetings, but I either do not have the time or the motivation. I show up without reading the materials and vote randomly or make poorly informed decisions. What is that? That is a violation of the duty of care. So these conflicts are quite typical. Imagine we take someone like Eric Schmidt and say, you will be a board member of some startup. He has hundreds of startups in his portfolio and sits on dozens of boards. He clearly will not allocate sufficient time, unless he consciously decides to do so, of course. So there is a high probability that a person may not take their role on the board seriously enough. Another major challenge is that startups are always lacking something. They lack expertise, they lack staff, they lack specialists, and they lack capital. And you need to know how to operate in this environment of constant scarcity. You have to clearly understand what value you are bringing to the startup. You cannot expect young founders, 18, 20, or 25 years old, to operate exactly the way things are done in large corporate structures. They simply do not have the time for that. To produce 60-slide presentations, that is ridiculous. It is simply unacceptable. And if you see them sitting there building 60-slide decks, the obvious question is, where is their time coming from? It means they are not running a business. They are just producing presentations. And that is a very negative signal. So you have to be extremely focused and concrete. And if you do not clearly understand what value you are providing, it is critical to ask yourself these questions. What exactly can I contribute to the company? And there are perfectly rational answers to that. If you want, I can share them.
Yes, absolutely. Very interesting.
First, you can help a startup raise capital because startups always need money and are constantly preparing for the next funding rounds. You can support fundraising through pitch preparation, investor outreach, and sometimes by meeting potential investors yourself and answering their questions as a more independent and credible voice, someone investors may trust even more than the founder or the CEO. So first, you can support fundraising. Second, of course, there is business development expertise. For example, at Toloka, I have a partner, Sasha Kolb, who has forgotten more about marketing than I will ever know. And when someone like that joins a startup board, it becomes a massive knowledge resource for the startup in areas such as marketing, scaling, and performance marketing. And of course, this person can contribute directly through their expertise. Now imagine a situation where someone joins your board who knows the right customers in your industry, someone who can open doors, make introductions to key decision makers, and help ensure that your startup's product is adopted by top-tier clients in the market. Naturally, such a person can be extremely valuable. These are also people who help attract and hire top talent. So the main categories of contribution are fundraising, support in sales and business development, and deep technical or professional domain expertise, as well as team building and recruitment. These are the core capabilities that startups typically need. And of course, financial expertise is always important as well, but that goes without saying.
Understood, Taras. What makes serving on startup boards attractive for board members? Okay, compensation is deferred or offered in equity. That's clear. But what else?
That's a very good question. First of all, it is always a long-term story. You join a story that is still very small and wants to become big, but whether it will actually become big or not is uncertain. And it requires a significant amount of time. So if you come from a professional management or startup background, you may join a startup because you believe in its business model, believe in the founders, want to support them, are ready to stay with them for 3, 5, 7, or even 10 years, and are willing to contribute in the areas and directions I mentioned earlier. And of course, you may receive some equity, a stake in the startup, in return for your advice. So this is a very good direction. Next, if you are not yet serving on any boards and want to try board work, this is an excellent opportunity. For example, I am always very happy when CEOs I know join boards of other companies because it allows them to learn to look at business slightly differently, and afterwards their own businesses improve. So here there may be an open field of opportunities for CEOs who want to join boards of other companies. Third, these may be professionals who want to invest their expertise in a promising field and are ready to do this systematically. They want to have a portfolio of such boards and startups, and in this way, having not just one board or one startup, but perhaps 5, you significantly increase your chances of receiving a strong financial return.
I have just imagined a typical American or British board member, someone 60 plus, experienced with a specific expertise and stage of life, and I try to picture this person as a member of a startup board.
Well, Eric Schmidt did that. He joined a startup that was then still called Google. There were 2 young guys. That's an example.
Okay, so can this model work?
Absolutely, yes, it works very often. In general, startup culture is built around the idea of paying it forward, around giving back. Someone helped you with advice and you're expected to help someone else with advice. That's why many people join startups simply to help others, especially if the startup's field is close to them and they clearly see how they can add value.
Taras, you have very extensive experience with boards and very extensive experience with startups. Are there any typical mistakes or perhaps best practices when it comes to setting up boards in startups?
Well, bringing in your relatives, bringing in people who don't really care, giving them seats on the board and waiting for results, that is mistake number one. Mistake number two is not clearly understanding what you yourself want. And there is, a saying, be a king or be rich, be king or be rich. What does that mean? It means that very often CEOs and startup owners want to be kings, they listen to others, but it is more like, a kind of surf theater style organization. Very quickly, this becomes frustrating for effective board members who joined in order to help the company grow. But on the other hand, it is the owner's company and the owner has the right not to develop it. What prevents us from taking a small grocery store on the corner, setting up a board there, and sitting around talking about how we will build a global network? Nothing prevents the grocery store from doing that. The only thing is, to build it, you need not only to talk about the work, but actually to do the work, right? And to take real action. The other scenario is startup owners, those CEOs, who want to be rich. They understand that in order to be rich, they need to build a large company, do it fast, constantly seek support, and consult with smart people. To have on their board people who are smarter than they are. So if they do not want the board to be a purely representative body, but instead want it to drive business growth, to help realize their entrepreneurial dream and their potential as entrepreneurs and as individuals, then they will not make this mistake. Another common mistake is when people who are not really needed join startup boards and later they realize that they are not needed, but they are already there. And then they stop showing up. Essentially, they become walking dead. They occupy a seat, they have voting rights, but they do not add much value. So it is better to remove them from the board.
And what if they were granted equity or shares in the startup? It may be difficult to get rid of them, but
if you are not adding value to the startup, why should you be on the board at all?
So their shares remain, but what about the board seat?
The shares remain. I have had several such situations. I realized that I was not adding value, and I simply stopped attending board meetings. Of course, you tell them, guys, I don't see how I am providing value to you. You once gave me a seat on the board. I don't want to formally resign from it, but I won't be attending. Please don't expect me.
Okay, and is there a truly best-in-class practice for setting up a board in a startup? Perhaps an example of a well-known startup that has already grown into a large company?
I believe it all starts with the founder, the person who understands that they cannot realize their vision on their own, and then they ask themselves the only sensible question, who can help me with this? Then they watch our conversation, understand who they need on the board, and find those people. The challenge for them will be creating the right conditions and incentives for such people to join. Let's imagine that they were very persuasive and found all the arguments, both financial and non-financial, for why strong candidates should come on board. Okay, then they must make sure that things actually get done. And look, when we talk about boards, we are now talking about a governing board, but boards can also include advisors. Advisory board members, absolutely. There is often an observer role. A person who sits on the board has access to all information but does not have voting rights even though they may be invited to speak. This is also a typical role. Often, especially on US boards, lawyers are present to provide support, to ensure that decisions are properly codified within the legal framework. So if you bring together such smart people, and if those smart people believe in the company, well, Godspeed. I think everything will work out.
Taras, what recommendation could you give to startup owners or initiators of startup projects when it comes to boards?
Well, I have already given it several times. I will watch programs about boards. Understand that if you do not yet have a board, you need to put one together. Figure out who you actually need on it. If you need to raise investment, please find people who can help you shape your pitch and make the right introductions. To certain investors, people who may invest themselves and also help you structure future funding rounds. If you need to work on strategy, have people who can ask the right questions, because a board is, to a large extent, about asking questions. And if you need to do business development, think about who in your industry can introduce you to the right clients and think about how to bring that person onto your board. These are pragmatic questions, not theory, but a clear understanding of what you want to achieve. But this is something you can seek advice on. I am once again recalling our conversation. Is Alexander Usyk possible without a coach? Let's remember, I have already mentioned this quote, that when Eric Schmidt was appointed chair of Google's board, one of the board members advised him, Eric, you are already an experienced guy. Maybe you should should get yourself a mentor. And he refused. And a year later, Eric Schmidt wrote that it was a mistake to refuse a smart person who could help him perform his role on Google's board. What I am getting at is that even very smart people, like Eric Schmidt and others, need good advice. That is why you should look for people who are capable of helping your business move to the next level. When we speak in Ukrainian to a Ukrainian audience, we clearly see a large number of strong, impressive Ukrainian entrepreneurs with resilient businesses built over recent years. But what typical challenges do they face? Their businesses either do not grow as fast as they would like or remain purely Ukrainian. And that creates the challenge of expanding beyond Ukraine and building the business both in Ukraine and internationally, and doing it faster. If you are a very early stage startup, then of course you must understand that your startup needs to target a large market. And Ukraine is a small market. That is why you need people with a global mindset, people who know how to do this. Very often when you build startups, you may do so within your existing corporation, but they need to be given freedom rather than being suffocated by corporate bureaucracy or accounting rules. That is why having some kind of sandbox or startup incubator within a corporation is quite common. And there should be boards there. These boards may include both internal people from the corporation and external members. The key thing is to ensure that they do not suppress the entrepreneurial initiative coming from employees, but instead help develop it, smoothing the construction site, so to speak, and removing excessive obstacles from a business that is only just being built. Now look, at Toloka, we make investments with fairly complex structures and hold board meetings once a month. And I imagine myself as a 19-year-old guy who has just finished school or university or is still studying who wants to build a startup. But where would he get this kind of knowledge? It's not just from books, not just from YouTube. And if you are truly building something big, you definitely need a board. If you bring smart people onto it, well, God willing, your chances increase dramatically.
You said that Toloka regularly creates boards for startups it invests in. How interested is Toloka in additional candidates for startup boards?
To be honest, we do not create boards all the time. We do so when it makes sense. Very often we come into companies where boards already exist. And if we are not a majority investor, then there are already lead investors who are probably sitting on the board. We often take observer positions. This month, I hope we will close a deal and we will have another such board seat. We also have a board that we helped create. And by the way, with Okunev's support, we ran a selection process for an independent director. Here in the UK, they found a guy there. So what needs to be done? You need to watch and track announcements and postings. But most importantly, you need to be able to add value and communicate with entrepreneurs. Look, this logic is not entirely obvious. Let's imagine a situation where I am a lawyer at a large corporation. What value can I bring to a startup? Until you have an answer to that question, it will be difficult to find a seat at the table of a startup board. If you do have an answer, then, just like a startup founder, you need to look at who you can help. Just as a founder looks for people who can help build their business. Yes, a person with expertise and a clear understanding of their value to a startup can say, listen, I want to be on your board. You still have to go through this, this, and this, and I have already done that. Would you like me to help you? You would have to be foolish to refuse a strong board member. For people who are just starting their board careers, and already have the right level of expertise, this is a very easy entry point into the profession as a board member. And we, as Toloka, have a kind of sacred karmic mission to help Ukrainian startups, and we often help wherever we can. But we are not a recruitment agency, and we do not search for board members. This is ultimately the job of the founder or those they hire to perform this task. Of course, we are happy to help, because we want to see many large, strong Ukrainian startups and businesses on the global stage. Why? Because we will invest in them, they will make money, and the members of Toloka will make money as well. At the moment, our goal is to close a deal later this month with a Ukrainian startup that has a strong board and operates in a large market. Well, God willing, everything will work out well, so believe me, you can spend a very long time knocking on the doors of various committees that select board members. But if you are a professional and know your own value, you can simply go to those people who live and breathe their idea and help them build a strong business.
Taras, thank you very much for a very interesting conversation and very practical advice.
Thank you very much for the invitation, because this topic is not particularly popular and no one has really explored it in such depth. At least you are the first to take such a serious interest in having a thorough conversation on this topic. So if our conversation helps even one startup become a billion-dollar company, then this time on air was not spent in vain. And I believe it will help more than one company become that unicorn. One that not only makes money for the founder, not only brings recognition to Ukraine, but also makes the world a little better.
Great. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. See you in future episodes.